Good evening, everyone. My name is Terrence Griffin. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement at Rutgers University, Newark. I want to thank you all for being with us this evening. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to Positive Feedback Bias, how white instructors harm learners of color, with Professor Kent Harber. I'll tell you a little bit about the professor. Kent Harber is a professor of psychology at Rutgers University, Newark. His research programs have two main directions. One focuses on interracial feedback, and especially the positive bias and feedback from white instructors to students of color. The other studies how psychosocial resources, such as social support and self-esteem, affect perceptions of the physical world and the social world. His research has been supported by many organizations, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and has been featured in many publications, including The Atlantic, Newsweek, and the Huffington Post. Professor Harber received his doctorate in experimental social psychology from Stanford University in 1995. His doctoral thesis on the positive feedback bias was awarded the Best Dissertation Award from Society for the Psychology Study of Social Issues. In 1999, he accepted his current position at Rutgers University, Newark. A little bit about tonight. If you have any questions for the presenter during the presentation, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. After his presentation, we'll do our best to accommodate as many questions as possible. For your convenience, this presentation will be recorded and posted to the Rutgers Alumni YouTube channel. After the presentation this evening, you'll receive an email, and in that email, a link to the channel will be included. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Kent Harber.
So I'm assuming that I am now online. I'm very much a 20th century person, so technology both amazes and sort of confounds me. But I'm going to assume that we're all together now. I want to thank the Alumni Association for inviting me to give this talk, Stephanie Bishke and Terrence Griffin for all their help in making it, for producing this, and all of you for being here today. Okay, so, all right, so my talk is on the positive feedback bias. One of the really vexing social issues in our country has to do with what's called the achievement gap, the academic achievement gap between African American and white students, but I think it probably also applies to some other students of color as well. And what these graphs here on the left show is that this is going back from 1973 up to, well, relatively current 2008, showing that there is this, even though all students are slightly improving over time, there is this stubborn gap in performance where students of color, especially African American students, are underperforming relative to white students. And there are a host of likely explanations why this gap occurs. One could be lower expectations on the part of some white teachers towards students of color. Another could be hostile prejudices, which could be overt hostility, or it could just be sort of benign neglect and not attending students of color. And then there's structural issues like the insufficient funding that often occurs for the schools that African American students attend. Any or all of these are probably contributing to this gap. But there's another explanation that was suggested by President Obama's Education Secretary, Arne Duncan, who suggested that there might be a challenge deficit to students of color. And what he meant by that is that there is a level of engagement where teachers really work with students to push them towards meeting their potential. That level of engagement, that level of challenge might be missing in the interactions between white teachers, students of color. Well, if this is true, if there is this challenge deficit, one area where it might be particularly salient is in instructional feedback. Instructional feedback is something of the multivitamin of learning. It does almost everything necessary for learning to occur. So in two very broad domains, feedback, and there's been the research on feedback is really extensive. It has the important sort of fundamental learning pedagogical tasks, including helping students understand what is the task that they're asked to complete. What are their expectations in terms of how well this should be done? It lets them track how well or how poorly they're doing. It lets them internalize standards that they can then move, carry with them as they progress. And probably most important, feedback teaches people how to learn. And that what I mean by that is that they basically incorporate these measures, these indications of doing well and what it means to do well. And they apply them, they become, in a sense, their own instructor. There are also motivational benefits. They increases people's feelings of control, their feelings of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you can do things well, that you have mastery. Interestingly, it creates greater feelings of autonomy, that working with someone else giving you direct feedback gives you a greater sense of your own capacity to operate on your own and increases the intrinsic motivation to learn. There's a very interesting study that showed that students who got even critical feedback compared to no feedback at all were more highly motivated to learn. So that's a lot from this one critical element of learning, feedback. Those of us in the learning profession know how important feedback is, but know how difficult it is to do feedback well, to be an effective feedback provider. The reason is you got to maintain this difficult and important balance between informational goals and sort of interpersonal sensitivity goals. What I mean by information is you need, the key element of providing feedback is to be clear. The recipient needs to know where they're doing well, where they need to do better. And that means that the feedback supplier has to be candid and also assert expertise. Often it's not a negotiation. There are certain correct and incorrect ways to master and to proceed in learning, and that's the job of the instructor to be clear about that. But then there's the other side of the equation, which is to be very conscious and considerate of the person of the learner. You need to protect their motives. You need to respect their dignity. And that if that doesn't occur, if it's just a cold sort of delivery of criticism, then that can alienate the learner from not just you, the instructor, but from the whole process of learning. And so keeping that balance is something which I've been doing this work now for 20 years, and I still find it each time to be a challenge. Well, in interracial encounters between white instructors and students of color, this balance can be overshadowed or can be intruded on by our society's sad and long legacy of racism. And I'm old enough now to have seen how much effort and struggle has occurred over more than a half century. But one of the aspects, one of the outcomes of this confrontation that we have as a society been making about the issue of racism is that to be racist is now in itself stigmatizing. That in many parts of our society, to be seen as someone who is racially insensitive is morally and even in other ways could be disqualifying. But beyond the liability it has in terms of how you're seen by others, many white people want to see themselves as racially sensitive and would be aghast to see themselves as prejudiced. That their own identity, the way they define themselves, makes being socially sensitive and racially sensitive a core part of their own identity. And they would be threatened to see evidence of themselves acting in a prejudicial manner. Well, if we add these interracial concerns to that delicate balance between information and sensitivity, it can tilt. And even though these concerns are totally appropriate, they're totally necessary, what can ironically occur is that in the effort to not be prejudiced, that can result in what I'm calling the positive feedback bias, where the informational goals are less heavily weighed than social sensitivity, and I'll be arguing that that can be at the cost of learning. Okay, so here's the program I'll be talking about, and I'm already seeing how time is passing, so I don't know if I'll get through all 4 of these studies, certainly all the first 3. Study 1 looks at this fundamental question: does this positive bias exist? And if it does exist, is it affected by the kind of threat that I just mentioned, the concerns about seeing oneself as prejudicial on the part of the white instructor? Study 2 is going to see whether or not the positive bias occurs not only in remote interactions, but actually face-to-face. And also, is it affected by whether or not the learner is white or minority, or African American in this case, and whether or not the learner is friendly or unfriendly. So you can just maybe sort of make your own guess where you think that might be going. Who would you expect to receive the most positive feedback? An African American who's friendly, an African American who's unfriendly, a white learner who's friendly, or a white learner who is unfriendly? We'll get to that, obviously. Then study 3 is directly testing whether or not the positive bias is due to whites' efforts to maintain a self-image of themselves as non-prejudiced. And if we have time, and I'm not sure we will, we'll look at how the positive bias affects not just what is said to students of color, but the manner, the diction, the style in which communications are given to them, feedback communications. And then I'll conclude by talking about some ideas for addressing the positive bias. Okay, let's get going on some data. All right, this is the initial study. I'm going to go over this in some detail because the design of these initial studies are largely the ones I'll be using in all the studies I'll be talking about today. So these were studies that I did at the University of Michigan, and here's how the drama unfolded. Subjects would show up. All the subjects were white undergrads at UM. And they were told that we're interested in peer feedback. Peer feedback, it turns out, when we told them, seems to be really effective. We want to find out why. And that's the reason for the study. And so, subject, you're going to get an essay written by another student here at the university who's in a writing workshop. Your job is to just give them any kind of feedback you think that will benefit their essay. We'll send the essay with your feedback back to that student, and then they can benefit from it. The subjects all subjects got that basic instruction. Subjects who were in what were called the black writer condition, they were led to believe that the student whose essay they were evaluating was African American. Those in the white writer condition believed that the essay writer was like them, white. And then we had a control condition. In this case, we told the subjects, hey, we have these essays. They're in an archive. We don't have no idea who wrote them. It'll never go back to them because we don't know who they are. We just want to see how students evaluate college level writing. The reason we have this control condition is that it takes out any concerns about how you're responding to another person, whether or worrying about hurting anyone's feelings, because there's no other person who's going to receive your comments. So you can basically just go at it. Okay, So now I got to tell you some stuff. This was not about peer feedback. There was, the actual writer of these essays was not another student at the University of Michigan. It was me. And so, true confession here is, as a experimental social psychologist, in my day-to-day life, I'm an upstanding citizen. Doing this research, I am lying like a sociopath. So we do deception in order to really determine whether or not, in this case, there's a difference in feedback based on the supposed race of the essay writer. Okay, so subject now is anticipating getting their essay from the other student, and then they're told, if this was regular feedback, you would know who you're giving feedback to. Well, obviously that person is not here, but to give you some idea of who they are, we had them fill out these self-description sheets. And this is a sample of a self-description sheet for both the African-American writer and the white writer condition. They're identical in all items. None of these items are particularly interesting. The age, sex of the writer, residence hall, except for item 12. And that one is, the question is, what campus organizations have you joined? Students, our subjects in the Black writer condition, they saw Black Students Union, indicating that their writer was African American. If they're in the white writer condition, that item was just left blank. And the people at Michigan just sort of would know by residence hall and some other cues that if it didn't expressly say something else, that the writer was white. And we double checked at the very end of the study. We asked subjects, what was the race of your writer? And they virtually all got that correct. Then we gave them an essay to review. We had two different topics. The reason we had two different topics, we wanted to make sure that any effect that we got wasn't due to some peculiarity of the topic we picked. So we had one on TV violence, another on environmental apathy. These essays are terribly written. They're filled with spelling errors, grammatical errors, punctuation errors, bad logic. They're unpersuasive. They kind of rattle on and on. I wrote them, and in the process of doing this research, I discovered I had an unexpected gift to write really terrible college-level essays. So the actual essays were a page and a half, and the subjects would then just actually write on the essay all their comments. So before getting to the results, I want to talk about an important distinction we made in the kind of feedback our subjects were making on these essays. One has to do with mechanics related, which are things like spelling, grammar, punctuation, word choice. The other is content, ideas, logic, beliefs, reasoning. We make this distinction because, again, an important part of this research is seeing whether or not, if there is this positive bias, is it related to subjective feelings, personal feelings of threat? Well, mechanics, we think, is pretty safe. That there are objective standards to back up. If you're saying a word is misspelled, you can just refer to a dictionary. If you say the grammar is bad, you can go to Strunk and White or a style book to back you up. And the other is that critiquing a person's spelling or punctuation, that's relatively mild. Most of us aren't horribly wounded to be told that, that we misspelled a word. Content is the polar opposite. When you are critiquing a person's ideas, their beliefs, their reasoning, you're almost really critiquing them as a person. And so those kind of critiques are going to feel more pointed, more hurtful. But unlike mechanics, there aren't clear-cut objective standards for when any particular argument is well-reasoned or well-supported. And so from the feedback supplier's perspective, when they're giving content-related criticism, there's a greater chance of being seen. If they're worried about being seen as prejudice, that's where that worry should be most acute. So here's what we were predicting. That for mechanics, where the threat's relatively low, we're expecting no bias feedback to a Black writer or a white writer. But for content, where we believe there is that higher threat of being seen or seeing yourself as prejudice, then we did expect there to be a positive bias, but only to the Black writer. Okay, so here's a sample of a critiqued essay one of our subjects did. And this is very representative. Subjects got very engaged in this task, and they applied themselves really sort of energetically. And what we did is that we counted up the number of comments that were positive mechanics and negative mechanics, and subtracted the negative from the positive to get an overall positivity of mechanics. And we did the same thing for content. Counted up how many positive content comments, subtracted the negative content comments, and got an overall metric of positivity for content. And here's the result. So let's start with the far right, where it says control. Those are the subjects who believed that there was no writer who was going to receive their comments. And the scale goes from negative 0.8 is extremely negative, and number 1 is extremely positive. So you can see that in the control condition, they're just slamming this essay for both content and mechanics, which confirms that these really were bad essays, and subjects saw them as such. Then you look at how feedback was given to the white writer. It's much more positive than to the control. So there's concerns. You don't want to hurt another subject's feelings, another student's feelings. But there's no difference in criticism for content or mechanics. Now let's go to the black writer. That's the column on the far left. Looking at mechanics, that's the blue bar. No difference than critique given to a white student for mechanics. Mechanics is safe. Content is a different story. And there we see the positive bias. And this is the first evidence we get of this positive bias. And content, as we recall, if that would be where there'd be more socially risky, particularly if the writer is African American, and that's what we got. More positive feedback, but only for content. And by the way, that study was replicated in a separate study, so we have some confidence that this positive bias is reliable. All right, so in the next study, we're interested in a couple of questions. One, does that positive bias occur in actual face-to-face interactions? When you're giving feedback to someone at a remove, like in our first studies, maybe you have more time to consider, there's different kind of pressures on you, but face-to-face, maybe in that real-time interaction, is it clear that the bias would occur then? It'd be important because some of the most important feedback is what we get face-to-face. The other question is whether or not the bias is motivated by these self-image concerns. So there's some good evidence that when whites during interactions with African Americans get some cue that they might be crossing a line, they quickly retreat and actually kind of overcompensate by being more positive. When giving feedback, as someone who's giving feedback, you're often very sensitive to the responses you're getting from the feedback recipient. Are they looking interested? Are they looking bored? Are they nodding their head? Are they being distracted? All those things tell you about how they're responding to you. So we're wondering, do those kind of subtle signs coming back, that kind of echo feedback from the learner back to the feedback supplier, does that affect feedback, but only particularly to a learner who's African American? All right, so let me walk you through. This is a very kind of elaborate, high drama design, but I'll give you a sense of how we address these issues. So subject arrives at the lab, and a few minutes, and they're acknowledged, and a few minutes later, another apparent subject shows up, who's always a female, and the experimenter comes out and says to the second subject, are you Janine? And that other subject nods their head. Turns out that other subject is not truly a subject. They're part of the experiment. They're another experimenter who is acting the role of being a subject. Janine, do you have your essay? And Janine reaches into a backpack, hands it to the experimenter. Other subject, hey, come. And then the true subject is told by the experimenter, come with me, I explain what's going on here. And the true subject is told, we're interested in peer feedback, that same line. You're told, Jean out there wrote an essay. She's part of, she's in this writing class. Your job is to critique Janine's essay, and then when you're done critiquing it, you and Janine will meet face to face, and you can tell Janine, what you thought of her essay. And they do that. They meet together. Janine, and by the way, I should say we had 3 experimenters, 3 Confederates who were African American playing the African American Janine, and 3 white Confederates playing the white Janine. We did that to make sure that if there was any difference, it had to do with the race of the Janine feedback recipient, not anything particular about any one person. And it turns out we checked and made sure that was true. During the interaction between the 2 of them, Janine has a vocabulary of about 4 utterances. I see, okay, huh, how about that? For half the time, Janine is very friendly. Okay, huh, well, I see, how about that? And that's kind of like a green light. For the other Janine, the other half of the time, Janine responds to this sort of icy, non-responsive, huh, I see, how about that? Just flat. And that seems relatively unfriendly. And so we want to see what difference that makes, and we then record these interactions and get data from them. So I just said a lot now. I want to kind of go over this so we're really clear on what's going on here. So we have a friendly Black feedback recipient, friendly Janine, an unfriendly Black recipient, an unfriendly Janine, friendly white recipient, and an unfriendly white recipient. For when the feedback recipient was friendly, Black or white, that's a green light to the student, to our subject who's giving feedback. It's saying, I'm okay with what you're saying, and I'm okay with you. There's no threat. If there's no threat, we expect there to be no feedback bias. What happens if the feedback recipient, if Janine is unfriendly? Well, from the feedback supplier's perspective, that's kind of unpleasant. But maybe this person just doesn't know how to handle feedback. It's not about me; it's about them. That's not a threat. It's certainly not a threat about the feedback supplier's racial sensitivity. And so we'd expect no bias again. But what happens if you're getting an unfriendly response from a Black feedback recipient? Well, here we have an alternative explanation for their unfriendliness. It could be that your criticisms, your critiques are being interpreted as racially insensitive. And if that's the case, that can feel like a threat to the white feedback recipient, feedback supplier's self-image. If they are threatened, and if threat is what causes a positive bias, we'd expect a positive feedback bias, but only if the recipient is African American and only if the recipient is unfriendly. Well, here are the results, and the results fit with that prediction. Start with the far right. We have a white writer. The yellow bar is friendly, blue bar is unfriendly. No difference in how positive the feedback was. If the writer is African American and they're friendly, they get feedback which is comparable to the kind of feedback a white person gets. No threat, no bias. But if the recipient is African American and they respond in an unfriendly way, then there's the positive bias, and it's more positive than feedback to the friendly Black or to either the white recipients, friendly or unfriendly. So what does the study say? What are its implications? Well, one is that in these feedback interactions, face-to-face, one is that there is a positive bias in face-to-face interactions. It's not simply, it doesn't only occur at a remove, it occurs during actual, in-person encounters. But it also means that for an African American, maybe other kind of minorities as well, but certainly for an African American feedback recipient, they're in a double bind. If they want to get candid feedback, then it's best if they don't challenge, if they don't show signs of, concern or disagreement. But if they do challenge, then they risk getting positively biased feedback. This is important because some of the best feedback encounters occur when there really is kind of a give and take, when there's a bit of a challenge between the instructor and the learner. That's where, at higher levels of learning, I find this when I work with graduate students, I want them to push back. Pushing back teaches them how to think critically, how to feel confident in their own point of view. If we're a minority student, they can either challenge but then get positively biased feedback, or they have to maintain this studied politeness. They might be deprived of that particularly rich and enriching kind of feedback encounter. Okay, I'm seeing that my time is running out here, so I'm just going to do this third study, and then I'm going to call, and I'll wrap up. So I do want to get questions from the audience. Up till now, I've been really pressing this argument that the positive bias comes from whites' concerns about seeing themselves as non-prejudice, as racially sensitive. Irrespective of how other people see them, they don't want to see themselves that way. And if they do start seeing themselves that way, then they respond by positively biasing their feedback. So this study wanted to see, directly test, does the positive bias come from these self-image threats? And another thing is, in the previous studies, our subjects were undergrads. We want to see, well, what about people who are actually going to be in the teaching profession? So we had students in a teacher training program be our subjects for the study. So here's how the procedure worked for this study. Like I mentioned, all of our subjects were there, and all of the studies, our subjects are always white. And they're told, they're going to be giving feedback, in this case, to a high school student. And they're given the same overall explanation about the purpose of the research. Then they're told by the experimenter, the experimenter sort of stops suddenly, looks a little bit embarrassed, slaps their forehead and says, "Oh my gosh, I totally forgot. I was supposed to give you the social issues survey. There's another research group that asked us as a favor if we'd hand out the survey. I should have done it at the very beginning of the experiment. I forgot, but doing it now just takes a minute." And all the subjects always say, yes, they'll do it. Okay, and by the way, you don't sign the survey. It's totally anonymous. When you're done, you fold it and you put it in that box with all the other surveys in there. So after the subject completes the social issues survey, they then get a description sheet about the race of their writer, just like in the previous study, so they know whether the writer was white, black. And then they get a poorly written essay, which they give feedback on. Okay, here's the key thing, that social issues survey. There were 3 versions of it. So subjects got one of these 3 different versions. One version was designed to boost the subject's feelings of being a good egalitarian, of being socially, racially sensitive. There are 12 items. I'll give you a couple to give you a feeling of them. So here's the question. Should government offices be closed on Martin Luther King Day? And as basically, you can answer basically yes or no. And most subjects would say, yes, government offices should be closed on this national holiday. Should the Confederate flag not fly over government buildings? Absolutely, it should not fly over government buildings. They get 12 questions that are like that, and each of them allow them to demonstrate their own racial sensitivities. And what that means is they're seeing from their own behavior that they're endorsing a number of items that are confirming that they are someone who is racially sensitive and anti-racist. Then at the very end, they're asked, can you name 5 African Americans in any of these areas? Music, poetry, politics, or sports. Most of us could probably come up with 10, 15, 20, right? So 5 is no problem at all. From the subject's perspective, if they think 5 is like the maximum and I'm coming up with 20, I'm really alert to the contributions of African Americans. So cumulatively, with those questions, with the ability to name African Americans in these areas, that is allowing the subject to show to themselves their own their own social sensitivities, their own non-prejudice bona fides. Subjects in the self-image threat version get these kinds of questions on their social issue survey. Should it be legal for private businesses to stay open on Martin Luther King Day? Well, I mean, there is no law against it. You're not going to arrest people for keeping the business open on MLK Day. Should people be allowed to keep the Confederate flags in their own homes? Well, God, who knows who would want to? But that's not the point. Is there a law against it? Can you jail people for doing it? No, the First Amendment protects people to do that kind of stuff. And then can you name 5 African Americans in sociology, psychology, physics, or math? The fact is, most of us would be hard pressed to come up with 5 Italian Americans or 5 Lithuanian Americans or 5 Irish Americans in these areas. But the fact that our subjects are struggling to come up with 5 African Americans in these areas then adds the feeling of maybe I'm not sufficiently alert to the contributions of African Americans. So cumulatively, the self-image threat version of the social issues survey challenges their own self-image of themselves as racially sensitive. Then we have a control condition, which should have no effect on your racial attitudes. Does your supermarket have many kinds of canned goods? Is parking sometimes a problem where you shop? Name 5 places where you shop. The control condition is a baseline, and it allows us to see, do you get more positive feedback when self-image is threatened? Do you get less compared to baseline when self-image is boosted? Okay, I know that's a lot. Let's move on. So here's what we're predicting. We've got subjects who are either assigned to a Black writer or a white writer whose self-image is either affirmed, unchanged, or threatened. We're predicting the bias only to occur, particularly to occur, when the essay writer is Black and the subject's self-image is threatened. So let's look at the results. I'm going to start with mechanics. Remember I said before that mechanics should not be a threatening thing to critique. And these results show that even though these bars aren't identical in height, there's no significant difference in feedback to a Black writer or a white writer if self-image was threatened, unchanged, or affirmed. So mechanics, nothing's going on. Content's a different story. Let's start with the white writer. If their self-image was threatened, that's blue bar, unchanged lavender bar, affirmed the aqua bar. There's no difference. In fact, you could just sum them all up with a horizontal line saying that this is the kind of feedback given to a white writer. And by the way, very important, this scale here is different from the other ones. The higher the number, the more critical is the feedback. For subjects in the Black writer condition, if their self-image was threatened, they had to ask to complete that survey that made them feel that maybe they're a closet bigot. They were the least critical. They were less critical to the white conditions collectively. They're also less critical than subjects who had a Black writer, but whose self-image, this is the dark blue bar, I think I've got this a little bit confused here, was boosted. I'm very sorry. I'm looking here at how I've labeled these. So the bottom line here. So I'm going to ask you not to look at this graph. I'm so totally embarrassed here. Is that we were able to turn on the positive bias by threatening self-image. We were able to turn it off entirely by affirming self-image. So that's the key point of the study. I'm looking at time here, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm going to give, I think I'm going to need to skip the final study and go to the conclusions. Now, what the heck, I can give you a quick little summary here. What we found in a lot of our studies is that subjects would spontaneously write these comments to the writer. We didn't ask them to do it, they just did. Here's a comment to a Black writer. Great essay, just fix the organization and grammar and develop the argument and it'll be fine. In other words, great essay, just do the whole thing all over again and it'll be fine. To a white writer. When I see college work this bad, I just want to put my head down on the table and cry. We never see anything this baldly critical to an African-American writer. What we did in this study, I'm just going to jump to the very end, is we wanted to see, looking at open-ended comments, is there a difference in what is said in terms of the overall content of feedback compared to the style, the manner in which it's said? We let the subjects believe they're giving answers to questions that they're coming right from the essay writer. What do you think about my essay? Or what do you think is the biggest strengths and weaknesses? Or this is my favorite one. My current major is pre-social work. I'm thinking of switching to journalism. What do you think? What we get is, in terms of these open-ended comments that are written back to the writer, the positive feedback bias. The essay is evaluated more positively to a black than to a white. The writer himself or herself is more positively evaluated, and the writer's ambition to switch majors to journalism is more highly endorsed if the writer is black than white. But we also looked at the style, the manner in which these kinds of comments were communicated. We looked at the sophistication, which is whether words were long or short, and whether the kind of diction was more complicated or simple. I'm jumping ahead here. I want to get to this final point here. But what we find is that if the writer is white, and we also looked at another element here, which is how comfortable did the subject feel giving feedback? Low comfort, average comfort, high comfort. It didn't affect the style, the manner in which feedback was communicated. It did make a difference if the writer was African American, but only if the subjects were feeling uncomfortable giving feedback. So if you look at the far left there, low comfort, subjects who felt uncomfortable giving feedback, and if the writer was African American, used a language which was more simplistic, less complicated, and more filled with sort of positive, comforting language. And so let me wrap up now. The positive bias, I've been doing this for over 20 years. Other people have been doing this kind of research. It's conveyed to African Americans, also to Canadian Aboriginals, to Latinos, Latinx. It occurs throughout the country. So we've shown it occurring in others in the North, in the Midwest, Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, and the West Coast. It occurs anonymously and face-to-face. It doesn't matter if the instructor is male or female, or if the learner is male or female. So why should we care? Well, one is that it can send to students of color these weird double messages. Like in that last study I just showed, explicit comments saying, you're doing great. But the manner, the kind of language used is suggesting that you need to be spoken down to, this kind of patronizing language. How is this going to affect minority students' learning? Well, if they're not getting clear, challenging feedback, which is where we started this talk, then they might not get the kind of mastery or develop the mastery that other students get. And another deficit is that over time, students of color might learn to distrust praise that they even legitimately earned. And the studies showing that when African American students get praise and they have some reason to distrust this authenticity, praise depresses them. Okay, so can the positive feedback bias be addressed? And I think it can. So one is just making instructors aware that this positive bias exists could be a first step. A step I recommend not taking is trying to suppress that positive bias through sort of mental efforts to push it out of your mind. When you try to suppress something, it bounces back harder. A very simple technique, which a lot of teachers use, is that they mask the students' IDs, their names, when they're grading their work, and they tell the students that's what they're doing. One of our studies showed that actual public school teachers, their tendency to show the positive bias decreased if they had more social support from fellow teachers and administrators. So providing an environment where teachers feel secure with their fellow instructors reduces the bias. And then the final suggestion is something called wise feedback. So other researchers have shown that when African American students get feedback where they're told ahead of time, expect to be criticized. I criticize everybody. And if I criticize you, it's because I think you're someone who can benefit. That African American students in particular benefit and blossom getting that kind of feedback. We've just completed a study showing that when teachers are allowed to give that wise feedback ahead of time, it reduces their positive bias to both whites and blacks. It allows them to give more critical feedback. So, okay. I want to thank all my collaborators and sponsors for helping me do this research. I want to thank you and open now for questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Harber. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. So I have a few questions. Just remind the folks who are here to go ahead and use the Q&A option at the bottom right of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. The first question is a little bit more general, talking about your research dating back to the 90s and the wise feedback that you just ended with back in the late 90s. If this concept has been known for over 20 years, why is it just now something that folks are hearing about?
So why are people now hearing about it? Is that what you're saying? Interesting question. So when we do these kinds of studies, they first go through scientific journals, and which is important because that way it can be vetted to make sure that it's reliable and properly done. I have been fortunate to have some of this research picked up by the popular press. So as you mentioned earlier, the Atlantic did a piece on it, Huffington Post, some other venues, but it is something which I do hope to more generally announce. I think it's important that that be done.
Great. Another question for you here is, have you or other scholars found effective techniques for counteracting these tendencies?
That's a really good question. And so that wise feedback is something which I have found useful for myself. When I start teaching my undergraduate classes on day one, I'm going to be a tough grader. Expect tough grades from me. That's who I am. But I do that because I think all of you are able to meet that challenge. Doing that, making that statement to all the class at one time, does sort of relax my ability to then be candid with any particular student. I think that business of that practice of masking students' identities, students' names, I've talked to public school teachers who say this is an increasingly common practice. And that has the double benefit that from the teacher then is really just only addressing the work, not the student who created it. And the students know that's how my teacher is grading work. They're only grading what I've done, not who I am. So.
And I guess a bit of a follow-up for that question is, how are you speaking with other professors and other teachers about these methods and sharing these methods?
Well, I do this mainly through professional conferences, or if I'm invited to give talks. Sometimes school districts have invited me to present on this, something which I'm increasingly would like to do more and more, because I think that this is something that hopefully educators could benefit from, but I also want to hear from their perspective to what degree they recognize this as an issue and how they deal with it.
Good. I just want to hop into the last study that you discussed, the study number 4, and some of the implications that were also mentioned. Mm-hmm. Is there any data showing that professors fear not overpraising minority students for fear of being labeled racist?
So are you saying, Terrence, that some professors are afraid of appearing to be positively biased?
Not overpraising them. And now they're saying that if we don't overpraise them, then
Oh, well, that's a great question. I think that's sort of at the core of this research. Though what seems to be and I would expect that there is some concern about public reputation that feeds the positive bias. But what seems to be the main trigger in my studies is the white instructors' concerns about how they see themselves, even when no one else knows that they are the author of that feedback. But that issue of social reputation is a really important one, and I think it's a good one to look at.
Great. So now this one's going to the second study here. How might you consider what has been referred to as microaggressions in that study?
This is the second study. This is, so this is the one where they had the Confederate who was either friendly or unfriendly.
Right.
And so, can you give me the question again?
How much you consider microaggressions in this study?
So when I did this is before that notion of microaggressions was sort of popularly considered. So I really didn't have that on my radar when I did the study. Without sort of addressing directly with the whole phenomena of microaggressions, my hunch is that the feedbacks, the instructors' concerns about inadvertently or for whatever other reason perpetrating a microaggression could lead them to interpret the unfriendly response from a Black feedback recipient as evidence that they did so, leading them to compensate by giving more positively biased feedback.
Okay, so changing gears here, switching gears here a little bit to talk about the in-class, the student a little bit more, and the in-class, I guess, implications here. There is a person who's a member or who's attending here who is a PhD student, and they're wondering how this bias translates to interpersonal interactions among classmates.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I can only conjecture, Terrence. I don't, I based on what my studies have shown, it might depend on the venue and the circumstance. So one-on-one, hanging out at the cafeteria or going to a bar where the situation is more relaxed, maybe less so, but maybe one more public. Let's say like in a seminar where you can be more conscious of what other people are thinking of you. Then it could become it could become more of an issue. Then it's a really interesting question, Terrence. I would add to another element, which is in all my studies, the subjects are giving feedback, or the instructors are giving feedback to a person they've only encountered once. But in graduate school, you develop relationships with people. And when you get to know a person better, their personhood becomes foreground, and their ethnicity or anything other, their other kind of group affiliations become background. And when you spend more and more time with a person, you respond to them as a person. And so that might also affect what happened with, with peer-to-peer relations in graduate school.
Are we able to slide to that last slide? One person's asking a simple question of if they'll be able to see your deck here, but if you're able to.
Tell me when I get there, Terrence.
Sure. We'll go to the, you have one that had your contact information. Keep going. All right, right there. Perfect. So I'll leave that up there so folks might be able to contact you directly for that.
Sure.
All right. And one last question here, and then we'll thank everyone and allow folks to go on with their evening. What are some of your evidence that these findings have reduced positive feedback?
There's a simple answer. Mark Twain had this great response. I was asked a question and I was proud to be able to say, I don't know. So I don't know. But there is a set of studies I would love to do, which directly addresses that question. I think it's the fundamental next step doing this research. Does this positive bias affect how well students of color learn? What is are they receptive to it? Do they, and are they shaped by it? And are they detoured by it? It's a really important question.
Absolutely. And one that, I mean, understanding that the criticisms and the feedback that students are getting happens and starts so early that it may, if it's something that's negative, it may curtail them, in elementary school and then just become compiled over time. So it's definitely something to learn if it is in fact effective.
That's a really interesting question, because there is some evidence that certain kinds of teacher expectancies that start very, very early migrate with the student. So as the student advances, yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So thank you, Professor Harber. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. If you'd like to contact the professor, his information is here. Please feel free to do so. Once again, on behalf of the RUA, thank you all for joining us this evening. And Professor Harber, thank you for being so gracious with your time.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.